Welcome everybody to week 3 of 6 of the unknown influencers of New Orleans music. So I hope you've enjoyed the first 2 weeks about 19th century composers, and last week, which I thought was just telling Charles how much I really enjoyed about the dance bands of the 1920s. So just to give you an update, today we'll be talking about the Goodson sisters, and then the next week will be Dave Thomas, who is a local musician and has done lectures for us throughout the last couple of years, is going to do a lecture on August 3rd about the story of Clarence Williams, and then Charles is going to be back about Latin influence of New Orleans music, and then Dave's going to wrap us up on August 17th. And if this is your first time or that you've been here before, just go to our website, friendsofthecabildo.org, and we have lectures going after this ends on the 17th. We have lectures starting on the 24th, basically all the way scheduled through November 16th. So I hope that you'll take advantage of those great lectures. And as a member, you always get to attend these for free. Just sign up, or you can always email me and I can always put you on the list. And, if you can't make it, we can always you always get a recording the next day. So with that, we've got a couple people here. So if you do give a question, put them in the chat. And as always, we'll email you afterwards the recording. So with that, Charles, this week is the Goodson sisters. So we look forward to learning a lot about a subject that probably needs to be explored more.
Thank you, Jason. Welcome everybody to the Goodson sisters lecture. So I've titled this "The Pioneering Female Jazz and Gospel Pianists," and then focusing on the three sisters from Pensacola: Sadie on the left, Billy in the center, and then Ida Goodson on the right. And so let's get started. As usual, I start off each lecture by giving some background for those who are interested in further research and reading. And so, as I mentioned last week, the Hogan Archive of New Orleans Music and New Orleans Jazz is a great place to start. I had just discovered last week that what used to be called the Hogan Jazz Archive has now been renamed with the following: Hogan Archive of New Orleans Music and New Orleans Jazz. So it was started in the 1950s to document the history of New Orleans jazz, and now focusing on a broader history, but part of that broader history includes this history that we're going to talk about tonight. And so I wanted to include the oral history collection of the Hogan Archive. And so specifically at this website down here that you can access, musicrising.tulane.edu/listen, you can listen to the interviews that were done with Billy and Dee Dee Pierce, Sadie and Ida Goodson, the three sisters that were featured in the lecture tonight. And then secondly, the Hogan Archive has published a journal, an annual journal called the Jazz Archivist. And back in 2001, when I was an employee there, I wrote an article that was featured right here. There's a picture of the front page, entitled "The Goodson Sisters: Women Pianists and Function of Gender in the Jazz Age." And so it was a topic that I kind of discovered and was very interested in, and I think it's still a fascinating topic. And I thought it was worthy of the Friends of the Cabildo lecture series. The Goodson sisters as a story are fascinating, and then their music is also intriguing. And then also I wanted to mention the Florida State Archives. They recognized Ida Goodson as a special folk person from Florida, and so they have an interview that is archived at this website right here, floridamemory.com. A really fascinating interview that I encourage you all to listen to. So in addition to the Hogan Jazz Archive interviews, and then a few articles in addition to the one I wrote here. One is actually, it's a book, Mary Unterbrink, Jazz Woman at the Keyboard, 1983, which I've featured the cover right here. And you can order that online. And then also Sherry Tucker, known as one of the premier historians of women in jazz. She wrote an online article or long paper entitled A Feminist Perspective on New Orleans Jazz Women in 2004. And the link is right here. And that was published by the National Park Service, the New Orleans Jazz National Historic Park. And it's a great article. It includes much more broader information on the history of women in jazz. And so I would just kind of add that this topic is generally reflective of the way that feminist history has influenced jazz history. And jazz history for a long time, from the 1930s to the 1980s, was largely male focused. And so gradually feminist history began to infiltrate the field. And so this is part of my research, and then Mary Unterbrink's, of course, and Sherry Tucker's. And so I encourage you all to check all these articles and scholarly resources out. So this brings us to the first slide of the content, and that is female pianists in the jazz age. When we think about female pianists beginning in the 1920s, this is kind of the main focus of the beginning of the Goodson sisters. You have to understand that it is based on Victorian precedents, and this is the idea that women were generally encouraged in middle-class households in the Victorian era to learn piano and then provide entertainment in the home, especially during socializing events, so that if you had guests to come over, one of the females in the family would sit down and read sheet music and provide entertainment for the guests. It would be the equivalent of putting on a record or a Bluetooth soundtrack or whatever today. And the piano was really not developed until the early 19th century. And so that would be the beginning of the Victorian period. So especially households that ascribe to kind of middle class respectability or upper class respectability would include a piano in the main parlor and then encourage especially many of the younger women in the family to play piano and then perform for guests. And so these pictures here reflect this general trend overall. And then this affected New Orleans and the beginning of jazz in some interesting ways. And I love to include Jelly Roll Morton's quote reflecting his views on gender and piano. And Jelly Roll Morton, as many of you all know, is one of the great early jazz pianists and arrangers, composers. Grew up as a Creole in Seventh Ward. And so in his biography, Mr. Jelly Roll, he says he was inspired to take up the piano after watching a concert at the French Opera House in his youth. And the French Opera House was the premier kind of opera house at the corner of Toulouse and Bourbon, at the kind of the peak of when opera was popular in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And then Jelly Roll's quote was, in terms of taking up the piano, that the only trouble was that the pianist that he saw at the French Opera House had long bushy hair, and that the piano was known in our circle as the instrument of a lady. This confirmed to me the idea that if I played piano, I would be misunderstood. I didn't want to be called a sissy. And so there's many kind of underlying themes within this quote. And number one is that obviously the piano was considered the instrument of ladies, and that Jelly Roll, in his view of masculinity, was not eager to take up the piano for that reason. And then also I include this picture right here. This is of Tony Jackson, who was considered one of the great piano professors of Storyville and New Orleans in the 19-teens. And he was basically an openly gay man, but Jelly Roll respected him as a pianist. And so the fact that Tony Jackson, one of the top pianists in the city, in Storyville, was openly gay, again, that kind of reaffirmed the idea that if you played piano, you would be known as a sissy if you were into essentially a masculine interpretation of instrumentation. And this also reflects general ideas within early jazz about women's role within the bands. And so, still to this day, unfortunately, it is considered somewhat unorthodox for a female to play a brass instrument. Um, and and so it's very interesting to acknowledge the roles that are ascribed to instrumentation and gender. And what we find is that by the 1920s, um, most jazz bands eventually begin to incorporate female jazz pianists into their bands. And so, on the one hand, this reflects an opening of the idea of gender and sexuality in the jazz age, where women can have a role in public performance. And then at the same time, again, like people like Jelly Roll, most men are not necessarily eager to be known as pianists. And so it creates a situation where any early jazz band then logically hires women as pianists in their public performance. And this also reflects the changes in the role of gender overall in terms of the public role of women. So in the 19 teens, especially, we have women taking on new roles in part because of World War One, more public roles, more jobs in the public, and then I think the opening of the jazz profession to women at this time reflects this overall change in gender roles. And so I'm going to go through a few of the most famous of female pianists in the United States and also in New Orleans at this time. And so I think at the national level, you have Lillian Lil Hardin, who joins King Oliver's Creole Orchestra in the early 1920s. She's the only female, and so this classic publicity shot. There's other classic publicity shots of her in there. She's wearing a beautiful dress. She's at the center, so they really want to feature her. She ends up marrying Louis Armstrong. She was his second wife. And then even when Louis Armstrong leaves King Oliver, Lil Hardin follows him, and I'm going over here to the left when Louis Armstrong forms the Hot Five. And so she also becomes an integral member of that and is also featured in publicity photos in the center, and logically so. And then also in the 1930s, she has her own solo career after her and Louis get a divorce. And one of her most famous songs from the swing period is Oriental Swing. And I'm gonna take my time this time because last time Jason mentioned that I may have been rushing too fast, trying to keep it in within the hour. So I think I'm gonna have a slightly more relaxed pace. But in any case, I'm gonna play you a segment of Lil Hardin's Oriental Swing, one of her most famous numbers from the 1930s. And this is just a taste of what this sounds like. Stop it right there. Great song. That was later reinterpreted by an Austrian DJ into a modern kind of, I would say, a disco song where he put an EDM soundtrack or drum beat underneath it, and that has actually enjoyed some resurgence. And then I wanted to move on to some other very well-known New Orleans artists, and that includes Jeanette Salvant Kimball with the original Tuxedo Orchestra, Papa Celastan's band. We mentioned them last week. So Papa Celastan recorded in 1927, and then here's a picture of Jeanette sitting in the background, and then this is a picture of her from the 1950s, and then this picture right here is one of my favorite pictures of them, of the band. Unfortunately, I cannot find a high resolution version of this, so we're gonna have to settle with this. But it's a great picture of the Tuxedo on stage with Jeanette Salvant in the middle, facing sideways. And I know that the Hogan Jazz Archive has a copy of this, but on the Louisiana Digital Library, the original high resolution version refuses to upload. But anyway, Jeanette Salvant Kimball, I will mention, is from Pass Christian, Mississippi, and was recruited by Papa Celastan after Bebe Ridgely and him broke up. And so Bebe Ridgely took their original pianist, Sweet Emma Barrett, with him to his orchestra around 1925. And this reflects, based on last week, the 1920s dance boom, where there was so much of a lively market for jazz that Bebe Ridgely decided to break off from Papa Celastan, form his own band. He saw there was enough market for that, and he took Sweet Emma with him. And then meanwhile, Papa Celastan on tour discovered Jeanette Salvant, who was an accomplished pianist in Pass Christian, Mississippi. So this has many of the underlying themes of tonight's lecture, which is not only the role of female pianists and the popularity, but also the discovery of them on the Gulf Coast circuit. So that brings us to tonight's topic, the Goodson sisters in New Orleans, Sadie, Billy, and Ida. And so the background to their family of the Goodson sisters there were originally 7 sisters, and that includes May, Maybelle, Della, Sadie, Edna, Wilhelmina, who becomes Billy as a nickname, and Ida. And the parents had Native American and African ancestry. The daughters claimed that I think the grandfather was Cherokee, and they came generally from the panhandle of Florida. But more specifically, they were raised in what would be described as a middle-class conservative Baptist household on Tarragona Street in Pensacola. And Tarragona Street still exists. It's in the old part of Pensacola. Unfortunately, the house where they lived was torn down in the 1970s when they built the freeway that connects downtown Pensacola to I-10. So the off-ramp basically removed the house in which the Goodson sisters were raised. And the father worked as a porter on the L&N Railroad that went along the panhandle of Florida. And then I wanted to mention this quote here, and this kind of summarizes, it sets the tone for a lot of the themes tonight in terms of where the sisters came from. So Billy said to Bill Russell in the Hogan Jazz Archive in 1966, I started playing blues. My mother and father, were very religious people. When the parents were out of the house, me and my sisters would get around a piano and have a good time. Somebody watched out for Daddy, and when he'd come, we'd break into "What a Friend We Have in Jesus," and he never knew the difference. And so they were trying to essentially balance their love for blues and ragtime with their strict upbringing based on their parents. And so I love this whole scenario of them breaking into a gospel song. And "What a Friend We Have in Jesus," for some of you all who may not be familiar with it, the melody is "What a friend we have in Jesus." So it's a kind of a classic gospel song from the early 20th century. And here's a picture of Billy playing piano in the 1950s. So that brings up the development of the sisters, and especially Sadie, during the 19-teens and 20s in Pensacola and New Orleans. And so even though Billy says the father never knew any of their activity in terms of playing this kind of music, eventually he did find out, and the parents allowed them to play piano at house parties. And so, I mean, seven sisters. Eventually, they were able to kind of grow up and do what they wanted. So by the 19 teens, Mabel, one of the oldest, performs at house parties, while Della played at church, and also she loved the ragtime songs. And by the 1920s, Sadie became known as the top pianist in Pensacola and would accompany Buddy Petit, Arthur Duvernay, and Mac, who were a vaudeville team from New Orleans, on the Gulf Coast circuit. And so this goes back to last week when we talked about the 1920s dance boom, the development of what was known as the Gulf Coast circuit, where bands and artists would travel along the Gulf Coast, essentially from New Orleans to Pensacola and all the towns in between, and they had a big influence on all the artists there. And so the Goodson sisters began to stand out so much on this circuit that New Orleans artists began to know them well, and so Buddy Petit, especially, who was based on the North Shore, told Sadie, according to her, "You play too much piano to be in Pensacola." So in 1920, she moved to New Orleans, where she performed with his band on the steamer Madisonville, the ferry that connected New Orleans to Mandeville. And during that time in the 1920s, I'm not sure the exact year, Sadie married drummer Abby Sheenay Foster from the band. And so over to the right, we have Hogan Jazz Archive, or Louisiana State Museum archive pictures of Sheenay Foster. And I will add that on the one hand, the steamer, they refer to it as the Madison, but I have come across evidence that was called the Madisonville, named after the town on the Chafuncta River at Lake Pontchartrain. Of course, it was a big boat building center. And then also, Abby Sheenay gets his name at this time, of course, in Louisiana. Everyone's got a nickname, and it was not uncommon in South Louisiana for someone with more hooded eyes to be called Sheenay, referring to them essentially as Chinese. And I'm not trying to be offensive, but this is again a reflection of just kind of the way that people viewed person's looks. And so this next slide right here, part of this touches on last week. So I showed this map right here of New Orleans from around 1910. It shows the ferry points from West End and Muhlenberg headed off to the North Shore. And so this was a popular excursion for people from New Orleans to go to the North Shore. And this is where they would take a steamer. And then I did find this one picture on a St. Tammany website, and then you can see the name Madisonville painted on the side of the boat. And so this is what makes me think that it was the Madisonville steamer boat. And that's the proof I have. And then here's the picture of Buddy Petit's New Orleans Jazz Band from 1920. Again, Buddy Petit based largely on the North Shore. One thing I did not point out last time was that Leon Rene, over here on the left, the main singer, was actually the composer of Sleepy Time Down South, the classic jazz song that was known as Louis Armstrong's most classic number. And so Leon Rene had moved with his brother Otis to Los Angeles in the 1930s. And so there's a really great story about when Louis Armstrong moves to Los Angeles in 1930. He then goes over to the Rene brothers' house for gumbo, and then they give him that song and it becomes famous. But I really wanted to show this in part because of the documentation of Buddy Petit's band and the relation to the Sadie Goodson story. So that brings up the other sisters who were still in Pensacola after Sadie had moved to New Orleans, and that's Billy and Ida, who toured New Orleans. Excuse me, they toured Florida in the 1920s. So Billy and Ida play for New Orleans bands such as the Tuxedo Orchestra and blues singers who did one-week stands in Pensacola. And this would be the early circuit known as the Chitlin Circuit, where black performers would tour throughout the South in these small black clubs. And then Billy claims that she substituted for Clarence Williams, and so that's a reference to next week with Dave Thomas, and maybe he'll include this story. But when he was allegedly a pianist for Bessie Smith, the greatest blues singer of the 1920s, who was on tour in Pensacola. And so Billy also claimed that she played for Ida Cox and Ma Rainey, the other great blues singers of the time period, when they came on tour. She also played the Black Vaudeville TOBA shows at the Belmont Theater in Pensacola. And so TOBA at the time stood for Theater Owners Booking Association. And the acronym became known for performers as tough on black asses, TOBA. And so it was kind of a cutthroat business back then. But a lot of smaller cities and towns around the American South had their black vaudeville theaters where the TOBA performances would occur. And then also Edna and Billy toured with Florida with the Mighty Wiggle Carnival, a black minstrel group, also in that same kind of vein of vaudeville. And then lastly, Billy performed with the Nighthawks Orchestra in Birmingham, Alabama in 1929. And this is a picture, allegedly, of Ida in the 1920s. I have yet to officially verify it's Ida, but it is included on the internet in many websites that are associated with Ida. So I don't claim to be verifying that it is Ida, but it's an interesting picture to represent nonetheless. And so what I'd like to do now is represent our second song, and that is Billy Pierce singing Bessie Smith's Gulf Coast Blues, which she performed with her in the 1920s. And so I have this picture on the left, the map of West Florida, which connected Louisiana to Pensacola. And then here we go, Gulf Coast Blues, Billy Pierce's reinterpretation of that old 1920s blues song done in the 1950s.
I've been blue all day. My man, he gone away. There ain't nothing but a cold for some girl I know. I tried to treat him kind. I thought he would be mine. Although I didn't know, 'cause he left me with those girls cold. The man may pass and he didn't leave me no news. Well, the mailman passed. He did not leave me no news. Well, I sure tell you well, he loved me when she loved cold blues. You can read.
Sorry. So I'm going to end it there. We don't have all night to play Gulf Coast Blues, but you get the idea. And I love the idea that Billy Pierce had recorded this song that she had performed with Bessie Smith back in the 1920s. And also it introduces us to Billy and Dee Dee Pierce in New Orleans, where they started off their careers from 1929 to 1945. And so the story is that around 1929, Sadie retires from playing on the Madisonville and moves to New York. And Billy is recruited to replace her on the steamer. So when the Depression hits, the boat was sold, and Billy began playing bars on Lower Decatur Street. So if you can picture the section on Lower Decatur Street between, say, Ursuline and Esplanade, It's not all that different today, but in the 1930s, especially in the time of the Tango Belt, again referring to last week's lecture, and before Bourbon Street arose after the end of Prohibition in like 1933, 1934, this was a popular place for clubs. And so, especially, she was known at playing the Kingfish and Corinne's. And in 1935, she married trumpeter Dee Dee Pierce, and they're pictured right here. A wonderful, beautiful color picture of them. Um, and she had met him while he was playing at Buddy Petit's band. And so, generally, they played the bars around Decatur Street, and then during World War II, they began playing bars around Alexandria, Louisiana, and that was because there were so many military camps in the Kisatchie area, Camp Beauregard. I can't remember the names of the rest of the camps, but anyway, Alexandria was kind of a happening town, and there were other New Orleans jazz musicians who moved up to that area because of the opportunities available. So that brings us now to the post-World War II period, and that is from 1946 to 62. Billy and Dee Dee played at Lutyens Dance Hall, which was located at Franklin Avenue and Murray Street. It burned in the 1960s. This is an area just a couple blocks off St. Claude, and this was a bar known as kind of a Creole bar. And I have to admit that Dick Allen, who was one of the curators at the Hogan Jazz Archive, told me that in the 1950s and early 60s, he would go see Billy and Dee Dee there. And of course, this is the time of segregation, so he was kind of taking chances in terms of potentially being arrested. But because it was a Creole bar, he just was assuming that the police were really not going to arrest people based on their skin color. And so it was kind of a gray area in terms of all that. And this would be located just a couple blocks off St. Claude. If you're familiar with, say, the Domino's Pizza store on Franklin, it's right across the street from that. And then also one block down from the old Woodman of the World Hall. So that brings us to jazz historians and those interested in recording New Orleans jazz in the 1950s did record Billy and Dee Dee at Lutyens in 1953. So I'm going to play y'all some quick excerpts. So Jumbo, of course, the classic Hank Williams country song, also covered by Fats Domino, was a huge hit in 1952. So I'm going to play you a segment of that from, again, 1953. So I thought I would give you all a segment of that just in order to address their repertoire, which included the latest pop numbers such as Jambalaya, and then also give you a segment of Chic of Araby. And the reason I like Chic of Araby is because partly Dee Dee sounds amazing, because honestly, Dee Dee often doesn't strike me as the greatest trumpeter in the world, even though people loved him. And I'm not taking anything away from him, but when he stands out, when he does some really nice runs, it's impressive. So here we go. So not the greatest recording in the world, but again, it's at a dance hall. What I love about these recordings are they really kind of capture the feel of what it must have been like to be at Lutchens back in those days and dancing. And again, it was a dance hall. It was not a jazz club. And so it's important to point out that jazz in New Orleans started out as dance music. And so even by the 1950s, it still was dance music. It wasn't concert music. And so, in contrast, for example, if you went to the West Village in New York City and you heard jazz, a lot of people would treat it as a concert and they sit there and they clap. But in New Orleans, still people danced to jazz. And so I think it's very important to recognize that. So that brings us to their revival at Preservation Hall. And so Preservation Hall was established by the Jaffe family in 1962, and then Billy and Dee Dee performed as really some of the principal musicians up until 1974, and this classic album cover of the Preservation Hall Jazz Band, but featuring Billy and Dee Dee. And I love this album cover. It's one of the most famous and classic of all the early Preservation Hall bands, and they have many famous musicians, including I'll see Pavageau, Jim Robinson, George Lewis, and Dee Dee Pierce, and then of course Billy Pierce sitting. And so a wonderful photo really capturing that time period when Preservation Hall was first started. So what I'd like to do now is play a segment from the Preservation Hall documentary where it features a little bit of Sweet Emma and then some of Billy and Dee Dee to really show their influence and their importance.
Play from your wrist. And always stay strong for a woman.
They call her Sweet Emma, but she wasn't so sweet sometimes, you know. She would especially get mean when somebody asked her to take a picture. She said, "Why do you want my picture? You know, when your company comes over, you know, you're gonna take it down anyway." Sweet Emma became ill. She had a stroke in I think 1982, and I was actually then called in to play as a substitute. And that's how I first came into Preservation Hall.
Well, don't ever let no one make a fool out of you. Well, you done it with me, baby, and you don't know how.
I was about 12, and Dee Dee and Billy had a job at a club, and my father had asked Dee Dee, the trumpet player, could my son come and learn some music, you know, with you? So Dee Dee said yes. Whatever he did was a lesson. The way he played was a lesson. I have never seen Billy without Dee Dee or Dee Dee without Billy. They were always together, always.
I want a little girl to love somebody. Give her every cent I got. Just a little girl you fall in love with me. You don't have to wave her hair or wear silk and wool. Learn to cook a soul. As long as she loves it so, I want a little girl to love me not. Give her every cent I got. Just a little girl to fall in love with me.
So that gives you a glimpse of the performing at Preservation Hall, which I think is very important, especially in the 1960s and early 70s. I'm trying to move on here. And then also a German documentary from the 1960s, which part of it is featured in that Preservation Hall documentary, shows Preservation Hall at that time. And so I want to show you the first few minutes of
Aber das
that,
Französische für
which shows Billy and Dee Dee
eine
playing
wirkliche
Ela Ba.
Attraktion. Den echten New Orleans Jazz, gespielt von ehrwürdigen.
And I would like to add that Ela Ba was a song from the World War I era. It's basically a Creole cover of the very popular Tin Pan Alley song Over There, which is written about World War I from the American perspective. And so the story is at the end of World War I, Ela Ba became a standard as a pop song in New Orleans, but from a Creole perspective.
Die jungen Leute, die sich für den Rhythmus des schwarzen Mannes interessieren, werden wohl kaum daran denken, dass für die Neger der Jazz mehr ist als eine Musik zur Unterhaltung. Sie werden nicht daran denken, dass Jazz die Inbrunst und Sehnsucht der Schwarzen ausdrückt, seit sie im Schatten derer leben, die eine hellere Haut besitzen.
So great version of that. And that documentary is fascinating. Actually has a great scene of the second line following that. But what I would like to do now is follow up with a video clip of the Preservation Hall Band live at Tanglewood in 1970. And this section of Billy's Boogie is great. So it's about a 3-minute section. If y'all will indulge her in letting her kind of take off. It's a great segment. But this segment really shows her prowess on piano, and also the way she is featured as star of the show. I'm going to stop it right there, move on, but I wanted to feature that in terms of showing, again, Billy's prowess on piano in terms of boogie woogie. And that brings up the fact that Dee Dee, her husband on trumpet, dies in 1973, and then Billy dies the following year in 1974, not long apart. And considering the fact that they were always seen together, they were truly a couple who I think Billy died of heartbreak. And then at Billy's funeral, it's important to point out that the Olympia Brass Band played A Closer Walk with Thee in front of their home at 1619 North Galvez Street, which honestly, I didn't realize that was their home until tonight when I really put this together in terms of this particular segment. And I've been by that block many times, and perhaps many of you all have too. So I hope the next time you drive by that particular block that you recognize this single shotgun house featured in this photo on the right. And then this picture on the left is a wonderful photo. I think it's probably taken by Ralston Crawford and available at the Hogan Jazz Archive, but a beautiful photo of them in their home. And I love the Catholic cross in the background. So anyway, that was a sad moment when both of them died. And then I did want to bring up the fact that A Closer Walk also is relevant to their spiritual repertoire. And that is, of course, because they grew up both in religious households, that religious music, sacred music was very important to them. So I want to play a segment of Closer Walk by Billy and Dee Dee, and then a little bit of Ida, the sister, playing Precious Lord. And also, I'd like to point out that the banjo on that segment was played by Narvin Kimball, who was the husband of Jeanette Salvant Kimball, who we'd mentioned earlier. They had met in the New Orleans music scene during the mid-20th century. So now I'm going to move on to Ida playing Precious Lord. And this is an album that she recorded around 1980, I believe, for the Florida Folk Commission, if I recall correctly. And so it's an album called Sings and Plays Church Music and Songs from the South. So here we go. I'm going to play you a little bit of this.
Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, Lord knows I'm wrong. Through the gate, lead me on, take my hand. Precious Lord, lead me on.
So I'm going to stop it right there. But Precious Lord, written by the great gospel composer Thomas Dorsey in the 1930s. So that brings us to Ida also plays the blues. And so Ida basically had made a decision at some points when she was younger that she was going to be a gospel performer and then refrain from playing blues music. But she still continued to play blues, and her album from the 1980s, of course, is entitled Sings and Plays Church Music and Songs from the South. But I think the title says Songs from the South to avoid the term blues, just because of her perspective on playing sacred music. So I don't think we have really time to play Tell Me Baby Blues, to play it, but it's available on the internet if you ever want to hear it. And so just understand that part one of the album, side one, was mostly gospel music, and then side two was kind of Tan Pan Alley or pop songs and blues songs that she grew up with. And so she, in the end, she actually never refrained from playing the blues. So I did want to show you this segment where Ida is featured in a movie from 1989 entitled Wild Women Don't Have the Blues, where they interview her about her childhood. And so this also repeats the refrain of Billy's perspective of them growing up in a religious household. So here we go.
You couldn't talk about that because we came up in a religious vein where you heard gospel songs, you heard glee clubs, you heard quartets, and things like that.
I heard the preaching of the elder, preaching the word, preaching the word. I heard the preaching of the elder, preaching the word of the Lord. I heard.
My mother and father was a religious person, and they liked music, but they liked church music. They didn't like jazz like we does. And of course, we could not even play jazz in our home while they were there. But just the moment they would turn their back and go to their society or a church somewhere or another, we get our neighborhood children to come in there, and we get to playing the blues and having a good time. But we have one girl on the door watching to see when Mr. Goodson's coming back home, or either Miss Goodson, because I knew if they come and catch us there, what we would get. See? And by that time, when they would be see my father or my mother coming back home, the girl would be saying, "Here come Mr. Goodson and them." And they'd be so close up on her, we change the blues, say, "Jesus, keep me near the cross." Then, after that, my mother and father get in and join us, and we all get to sing in church song right now.
Gracious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am born again. To the good, to the sea, lead me on, let me stand. Gracious Lord, take my hand, lead me on. God.
Most of your great performers and singers, and that.
So I hate to interrupt Annie Barker, the great raconteur, on this subject, but we're going to move on. Sorry. And that brings us to Sadie in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so Sadie ended up replacing Billy at Preservation Hall during that time period, almost 20 years. And she recorded a couple albums, one with Sammy Remington, and another with her husband, Sheik Kohler. And so I wanted to play y'all some segments of these. Partly Don't Get Around, which was kind of a jazz standard from the Duke Ellington Band, but it features her singing, and I really wanted to let you all hear this. And then we'll move on to Sadie's Special.
Mr. Saturday night took that far flow. Babe, you know you can't get over. Don't get around much anymore. Oh, Mr. Saturday night.
So, excuse me, I'm going to stop it right there. Move on to Sadie's Special, recorded with Sadie and her husband, Sheik Kohler, just to give you an idea also about this time period in her life. And also this reflects her prowess as a pianist, similar to Billy's Boogie Woogie on Billy's Boogie. So you get the idea. Sadie, a great, amazing pianist in the same vein as her sisters. And I wanted to bring up the fact that she married Kid Sheik Kohler in 1982, and then featuring this photo here from Sidney Bird, the great New Orleans photographer, showing her at Jazz Fest with their Jazz Fest t-shirts in 1991. What a great photo. I love this photo. And so that brings us to the conclusion of the Goodson sisters. And so let's just go ahead and run down the line. Number one, it represents the importance of female musicians, and especially pianists, in a largely male-dominated profession beginning in the 1920s. And then from that, the legacy of female pianists as a reflection of middle-class female respectability evolving into a new role for women in public performance with the jazz age dance boom. And we've seen that with a number of female pianists in this performance and in this slideshow. And then also it represents the legacy of the Gulf Coast circuit from the 1920s, the influence of New Orleans on the rest of the Gulf Coast as the bands traveled and then also the draw of opportunity to the economic music hub. And so the fact that all three sisters were drawn to New Orleans over their years and found actually successful careers in New Orleans. And then also their repertoire reflects the strong influence of both religious music and secular styles in the South, and the decision of artists to include both styles in their repertoires. And especially, I think of Ida, who especially renounced her secular music, but then continued to perform secular music. And many of y'all might be familiar with the drummer Barry Martin. And he was the one that told me that Ida continued to play blues well into her older years. And so I haven't really mentioned this, but Barry Martin and I and Bruce Rayburn of the Hogan Jazz Archive did a presentation in Pensacola in, I want to say, 2001, where we presented on the history of the Goodson sisters, and some of their family members came out, and so Barry performed some of their songs, and it was a great moment for me as a historian to be able to connect with the family of the Goodson sisters in Pensacola and have them really appreciate the recognition of their great family. And Norman Vickers, if any of you are familiar with him, he's considered the jazz historian and promoter of Pensacola, and he deserves also a lot of reflection and support. So then, lastly, it's important to recognize the role of Preservation Hall that the club provided in 1962 in providing a career revival and boost for older musicians. And so it's when you think about what Billy and Dee Dee were doing at Lutyens compared to Preservation Hall and all the notoriety and the publicity that Preservation Hall provided them, we really have to give Preservation Hall a lot of credit. And then in conclusion, I'm just going to wrap up here. So Sadie, the oldest, died in 1996. And then Billy died, or as we mentioned, in 1974. And then Ida died in most recent 2000. And the fact that we visited Pensacola and presented this show in around 2002 it's a sad moment that we were not able to recognize Ida. So anyway, I'm going to conclude there. Jason, if you'd like to include any questions.
Sure. Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to jump in there and ask a question to get it started off, and maybe it might be your only question, but you mentioned Preservation Hall and the importance that they played for older musicians, and they still play that to today, and specifically also women, female, specifically piano players, but I don't see that anymore at Preservation Hall. Do you think is it that those musicians were never replaced with other female musicians and that there's not those musicians available for that more? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And that Preservation Hall documentary basically kind of gets at that, at the fact that that once Sweet Emma died and then Sadie died, they were largely replaced by male musicians. And I think what happened was the piano lost its stigma from the early 20th century as a instrument of ladies and the association with the non-masculine instrument. And so, unfortunately, that's kind of the case. There are a few female instruments, pianists around, and I think Marie Watanabe might be one. I would love for anyone else to chime in to remind me of other ones, but
and there are other female bands, I mean female brass bands and everything out there now today that are out there. But one other question semi-related to it is why is it that the piano seemed to be the one that they all gravitated to? Just because it was there, or
In terms of women,
yeah,
well, I think it had to do again with that late Victorian time period where it was kind of natural for women to be the pianists in the home, and then when jazz developed, if they wanted a pianist at that time, they would draw from women who grew up in a middle class home where they learned piano. And so again, most men did not want to be associated with a piano, and Jelly Roll, I think, is kind of an exception. And I think in the 1920s it changed, and then gradually it changed over the 20th century. But I think that's largely the root of it.
thank you. Danielle
Yeah.
Barbara asked, what was their influence by Mahalia Jackson? Or did they have influence by Mahalia Jackson?
Well, that's a good question because Ida, in that segment of "Wild Women Don't Sing the Blues," has a picture of some woman on her piano, and I was wondering if that was Mahalia. And so I would say that, especially for someone like Ida, who considered herself somewhat of a sacred performer in terms of repertoire, she would admire Mahalia Jackson. And so that's a great question, by the way. And I wanted to point out that people like Ida and Mahalia Jackson, they would sing songs that, in terms of the music itself, the rhythm, the feel, most people would consider jazz, but the lyrics themselves would be considered spiritual or sacred. And so that's a very important distinction to make. And also it's just important to acknowledge that in jazz, a lot of the origins include sacred music, and so that's part of what I'd like to recognize tonight is the sacred influence in jazz music. And just because there's a swing beat or a shuffle, that doesn't mean that it's the devil's music. So really, it has more to do with the lyrics. And so that's a very important point to make. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question because I mean, obviously, Mahalia's influence on all New Orleans music, gospel music, everything is so big, and
Yeah.
even though she's very well known, it's still underrepresented on how influential she was.
Yes, it is.
So with that, I want to thank everybody for taking part tonight, and we will be getting out the recording for tomorrow. Just a quick reminder, next week at same time, we have Dave Thomas doing the story of Clarence Williams. We had originally thought we were going to do two Williams, Clarence and Spencer Williams, not related in the same one, but Dave says they are too important to put into one. So he's going to separate them out. So we hope to see everybody again next week on Tuesday at 4:00. And thank you again, Charles. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
All right. Thank you all too. Good night.
Thank you.